Early Church Fathers, September 9th. Origen de Principiis Periarchon, on First Principles, Book 3, Chapter 1, Sections 19 to 22. Free will and God's gift of willing now. Many point to Paul's words, "It is God who works in you both to will and to do." Philippians 2:13. They argue that if willing is from God and doing is from God, then whether we choose evil or good must also come from Him. So how can there be free will? But here's the truth. Paul did not mean that God causes us to will evil, nor even that He directly causes us to will good. Rather, he spoke in a general way. Just as God gave us life itself, so too He gave us the very power of willing. As from God we have life and motion, so also we have the faculty of will. But just as the ability to move my hand is from Him, while the striking of another with it is my own misuse of His gift, so also the general power of willing comes from Him. But the choice of good or evil depends on me. Thus, I confess, to will and to act are gifts of God, but whether that willing and doing are noble or corrupt is left to human freedom. The potter and the clay, some stumble over Paul's words in Romans 9. He has mercy on whom He wills, and He hardens whom He wills. Has not the potter power over the clay to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? They say, if God, like a potter, makes one vessel for salvation and another for destruction, then free will is meaningless. But we must ask, can Paul contradict himself? Surely not. If everything were determined by God alone, how could he rebuke the Corinthians for fornication? How could he praise Onesiphorus for seeking him in chains? 2 Timothy 1:16-18. How could he write, "We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, to receive according to what each has done, good or bad"? 2 Corinthians 5:10. If our destinies were fixed by creation, then reward and punishment would be unjust. And yet Paul teaches in another place, "In a great house are vessels of gold and silver, wood and clay, some for honor, some for dishonor. If anyone purges himself, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified and useful to the master." 2 Timothy 2:20-21. Notice carefully, it is the one who purges himself who becomes a vessel of honor. The responsibility lies in us. Here is the fuller point. God indeed forms vessels for honor and dishonor, but He does so on the basis of what the vessel has already chosen. The vessel furnishes its own cause. One cleanses itself and is made for honor, another pollutes itself and is made for dishonor. Therefore, even Jacob and Esau were loved and hated not arbitrarily, but according to deeper causes already at work before their birth. This preserves both divine justice and human responsibility. Souls from one lump. The apostle's metaphor is exact. One lump of clay lies before the potter. Likewise, all rational souls share the same nature. Yet from this one lump God shapes vessels differently, on the basis of prior causes, not arbitrary will. So when Paul rebukes, "O man, who are you to answer back to God?" Romans 9:20, this rebuke does not apply to the righteous, who like Moses speak with God face to face. It falls upon unbelievers who argue not to learn, but to oppose. If some say that there are different kinds of souls, one destined to perish, another to be saved, we answer, the apostle himself affirms one lump. There is one Creator, not two. And if some vessels become dishonorable, it is not because God created them evil, but because of what they have chosen for themselves. And even here is hope. A vessel once made for honor can, through negligence, become dishonorable. A vessel once made for dishonor can, by cleansing, become honorable. Thus some Israelites fell from honor, while some Egyptians and Edomites, by faith, entered the house of God as vessels for honor. Every rational being is free to move from good to evil, or from evil to good, and because the soul is immortal, this movement stretches across many ages and worlds, reconciling God's will and our freedom. Finally, let us hold both truths together. In one place Paul says, "If anyone purges himself, he will be a vessel for honor," as if all depends on us. In another he says, "The potter has power over the clay," as if all depends on God. These are not contradictions, for we cannot will or act apart from God's gift, and God does not will or act in us apart from our own choices. Our will is the matter from which God shapes us. By our disposition He knows whether to form us for honor or dishonor. This is the mystery of free will. God is the giver of the power to will, yet the way we use it is our own. Augustine of Hippo, The Confessions, Book 11, Chapter 21, Section 30, reading. The earth was invisible. From the words of Genesis, I recognize the rich variety of ways your people have sought truth, O Lord. One says, "But the earth was invisible and without form, and darkness was upon the deep." That is, this corporeal thing which you made was still the formless matter of physical creation, without order and without light. Another responds, "But the earth was invisible and without form, and darkness was upon the deep," meaning that this entire whole, called heaven and earth together, was still formless and shadowed matter, from which the visible heaven and earth and all their sensible creatures were later shaped. Formlessness as the common starting point. A different one declares, "But the earth was invisible and without form, and darkness was upon the deep." That is, this totality, heaven and earth, was still unshaped and dark matter, from which would come not only the visible earth and sky, but also the intelligible heaven, the heaven of heavens. From this formless beginning, you would create every invisible and visible creature. Another voice insists, "But the earth was invisible and without form, and darkness was upon the deep." Scripture did not call this formlessness heaven and earth, but it already existed as what it named, the invisible and formless earth, the dark deep. This is what had been meant earlier when it was said that you, O God, created heaven and earth, the spiritual and the corporeal creation alike, the entire mass of creation. And still another explains, "But the earth was invisible and without form, and darkness was upon the deep." There was already a formless matter, the Scripture having declared earlier that you created heaven and earth, that is, the entire mass of the corporeal world. This vast mass was divided into its two great parts, the higher and the lower, with all the familiar and known creatures that would come to dwell within them. This is how your words echo in many ways, O Lord, and I see how each one who listens and believes can rightly draw such meanings from the richness of your Scripture. Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologica, Part 1-2, Question 9, Articles 1-2, Question. The movement of the will. Article 1. Whether the will is moved by an external principle. Objection. 1. It seems the will is not moved by anything external, for if it were, it would no longer be free but forced. Objection 2. Moreover, the will, being the highest power of man, cannot be determined by something lesser. An external cause is always beneath the dignity of the interior faculty. Objection 3. Further, movement caused by another is not truly our own act. If the will were moved by an external principle, merit and blame would vanish. I answer that the will can indeed be moved by something external, yet in two distinct ways. First, externally as an object presented to it, for just as the visible object moves sight, so the good apprehended moves the will. Second, externally, by an efficient cause acting from without. Here we must distinguish. Nothing can move the will as an efficient cause except God Himself, who is the universal mover of all things. Creatures may present motives, but the inward act of the will remains ours. Thus, external things may incite, but they do not compel. Only God, as the first mover, can move the will inwardly, yet even this movement does not destroy freedom, for He moves all things according to their nature. He moves the stone downward by necessity, and He moves the will freely toward its object. Quick summa. The will may be moved externally, by objects as motives, and by God as first efficient cause, but never so as to destroy freedom. Article 2. Whether the will is moved by the sensitive appetite. Objection 1. It seems the will is moved by the sensitive appetite, for passion often overcomes reason, so that the will follows lust or anger. Objection 2. Moreover, Aristotle teaches that desire can bend the judgment of the mind. Thus, the lower appetite seems to move the higher. Objection 3. Further, experience shows that even when reason warns against a deed, the impulse of passion drags the will along. Responsio. I answer that the sensitive appetite can incline the will, but it cannot move it as a cause. Passion stirs the imagination and presents goods as pleasant or evils as bitter, and so proposes motives. Yet the will, precisely as rational appetite, remains free. If sometimes passion seems to conquer, it is because the will consents. The lower power has no authority to compel the higher. Still, it is true that vehement passion may obscure reason's judgment, and so the will is influenced indirectly. But formally and properly speaking, the will is not moved by the sensitive appetite as by a mover. Rather, it is the will that governs the lower appetites. Quick summa. Passion may incline and obscure, but it cannot move the will as a true cause. The will always remains free. Story. Zach and the Tug of Desire. Zach sat in his dorm room staring at his textbook. He had promised himself he would finish the chapter that night. But his phone buzzed with a message. Party at the quad. Everyone's going. A rush of excitement pulsed through him. The desire for belonging, the thrill of the evening pressed hard upon him. At that moment, his lower appetite painted the party as the supreme good. But deep inside, another voice spoke. You know your commitments. You know the test tomorrow matters. Zach felt the struggle, one power pulling, another reasoning. Finally, he set his phone down. Not tonight. The desire did not vanish, but his will refused its command. The pull of passion was real, yet it could not drag him apart from his consent. The freedom remained his own.